Hello, 7th graders. This is Mr. Shear, and today we're looking at the impacts of the War of 1812. So as a just quick reminder, this was a 5-day topic. Day 1, we looked at a brief overview of the war. Day 2 was Tecumseh and the Native American role. Day 3, we looked at some key events, including the Siege of Detroit, the burning of the White House, the creation of the Star-Spangled Banner. Day 4 was all about the Battle of New Orleans and Andrew Jackson. And then today, Day 5, impacts of the War of 1812. So we're on the last day of our 5-day unit on the War of 1812. So we're going to start by looking at who were the winners and the losers of the war, and we'll start with the United States. So this war in U.S. history is pretty much officially viewed as a tie. Some of the negative things for the United States is we did lose more soldiers in Britain. We had the opportunity to take much of the land in Canada, and we failed. Initially, our overland battles were pretty badly executed. And in the end, when we signed the treaty, everybody just agreed to the current boundaries as is. We gained a little bit of land, but really, for the most part, we gained no new land. However, we did hold our own against the greatest army in the world at the time in Britain. So patriotism soared after the war. We did win some big key battles like the Battle of New Orleans. We held our own in the Battle of Baltimore, where the Star-Spangled Banner came from. And then to everyone's surprise, including our own, we dominated the naval battles on the lakes and seas. Britain. All right, well, that's the other half of the tie. So for Britain, this war is officially viewed as, again, a tie. If it's viewed at all, for the British, this war is often lumped into their greater wars with England. And for the British Empire, this really is a small skirmish. They were spread all across the globe, and the War of 1812 is not that impactful for Britain. However, they did keep the United States from moving north, even if they weren't able to keep us from moving west by putting in a Native American country. So really the big British goal was to define boundaries, and they were able to do half that. But the losses at New Orleans and Baltimore were humiliating for the British. But overall, a tie between the United States and Britain. So if there is a clear winner in the war, is Canada. Canada, which at the time was a sparsely populated area of fur trappers, is able to establish its boundaries and earn world respect. And for Canada, they view the War of 1812 almost like an Independence Day war, or an independence war. This is really a huge event for them, Canadian national pride. This is where a lot of their early heroes come from, and they're able to hold their own against the larger United States Army. And this really establishes Canada as what would become a future country. If there is a loser in the war, it's the Native Americans. And the War of 1812 really represents their last major effort of Native Americans to have their own independent nation. Overall, they're greatly weakened with the death of Tecumseh and the loss of the United Native American Army. And they're never able to get that nation, obviously, in the middle of the country. And it's not too much longer after this that really the conquest of the natives begins, and most of them end up on reservations, if they survive at all. All right, so we're going to look at the biggest impacts or effects, and really the biggest impact is the U.S.-Canadian boundary. So this is a blurry map of kind of the territory at the time. Remember, most of the battles and the territory that was disputed was this Indiana territory here. And what I want to show you is kind of a modern map of Canada and the United States. And what I want to point out is look at this straight line. This is the biggest impact. And if you're wondering why we've covered this war in a Washington State history class, it's because of this straight line. Nothing said that this line had to be straight. But when the War of 1812 ended, it established what is basically a pretty straight boundary right here between what became Canada, the British land, and what was turning into the United States. And eventually this line would be extended to Washington and Oregon. Also, as mentioned, this land here was disputed by the Great Lakes, and if Britain had gotten it, there would be a whole nother country right here in the middle of the U.S., and I don't think we ever would have expanded to Washington or Oregon. So if there's one big impact from the War of 1812, it's that it clears the path to the west and westward expansion to where we now live, and it establishes a pretty set boundary line that makes it inevitable, in my mind, that we would make a claim on Washington and Oregon. So again, the boundaries, the war determined the modern boundaries of the United States and Canada. That straight line would eventually continue over to Washington and the Oregon Territory. And then there's no native country in the middle of the United States. And if the British have won, there would have been. So all of this leads to the eventual U.S. claim on the Oregon Territory. Another big effect is we get some heroes and some big songs out of this war. So of course there's Andrew Jackson. We talked a lot about him. He's a huge hero from the war, and he'll ride that fame to the White House, as will William Henry Harrison. Tecumseh's nemesis, unfortunately Harrison dies 30 days into his presidency, so he's not super well remembered, but he was very popular at the time. You have the USS Constitution, also known as Old Ironside, and one of the most famous boats in the United States. And of course, you got the Star-Spangled Banner. So lots of things come out of this war. Another effect, the United States grows up a little. What I mean by that is we did not have a regular full-time army until after the war. And so the United States establishes a 10,000 man full-time army. And I think a lot of that is in response to the British burning down the White House. We realize we need trained soldiers at all times. 10,000, just to give you an idea, is not a very big army. Our modern army today is about 1.3 million men and women who serve full-time in the U.S. Armed Forces. That does not include the 865,000 men and women who serve as reserves. So at any given time, we have 2.1 or 2.2 million people ready to activate in our military. Another effect is the economy boomed during the war. So if you remember, one of the causes of the war was the Embargo Act, where we would not allow British and French boats to land in U.S. ports, and we created a blockade for ourselves. And while this was very unpopular, it did force U.S. businesses to make more goods and services here in the USA. Also, war changes what you make. Clothing, guns, weapons, all those things are wartime supplies. And in response, a bunch of factories were built up, old factories were refurbished, and the United States started producing more goods and services for itself. And eventually this helps lead into an economic boom and the creation of a second Bank of the United States. And of course, if the White House was burned down, it had to be rebuilt. So the modern White House was rebuilt after the war, and the president was able to move in 1817. But the White House that we see today was built after it was originally burned down in the War of 1812. And lastly, there was a huge period of patriotism that came out of this war and American pride. We had defended ourselves against the British. Don't forget impressment, where they were taking tens of thousands of U.S. soldiers and forcing them into their British military. We had successfully held our own against the largest, strongest army in the world. This leads to a ton of pride, and the period following the war is often called the era of good feelings. And the last big effect, which you will hear more about in 8th grade, and probably in high school history as well, the Monroe Doctrine. And what the Monroe Doctrine is it's a document, a proclamation written approved by Congress, and sent by President James Monroe to Europe, and it basically says 4 things. And again, this Monroe Doctrine is, to this day, the most famous U.S. foreign policy document. It says 4 things. The first thing it says is the United States won't interfere with conflicts in Europe. The second thing it says is the U.S. will recognize and not interfere with existing colonies in the Western Hemisphere. So Canada is still a colony of Britain. We're not going to mess with them, and we're not going to mess with European affairs. However, the doctrine says that in return, Europe is not allowed to mess in the Western Hemisphere, which is North and South America. So all new colonization is closed to Europe. And by any attempt by Europe to control a country in the Western Hemisphere will be considered an attack on the United States. This doctrine, in short, says, Europe, we're putting up a fence. You stay on your side. We're not going to mess with your affairs. We're going to stay on our side. You're not going to mess on our affairs. And it's really the United States saying, you know what? The North America is our area. We're taking this land and proclaiming it our domain. And that's it, guys. I hope you enjoyed this whole unit on the War of 1812. That's just a little bit of the impacts of the war. As always, 7th graders, I appreciate you watching, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.